All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm going to start sharing my screen here in just a moment. So welcome to this afternoon series. My name is August Ball. I am the founder and CEO of Cream City Conservation. This session is entitled From Toxic Donut to Truax Field, How Structural Racism Harms People and the Planet. I'd like to start us off by explaining a little bit about who I am and the work that I do within my company. We are a social enterprise, which means that we take the profits from the consulting work that we do with mostly environmental organizations, government entities, non-for-profits, and then we use those funds to provide paid training and employment opportunities for young adults who have been historically excluded from the environmental movement, training them up to work in careers in conservation, in green infrastructure, urban agriculture, as well as public policy through various partnerships. We also are piloting a reentry program for returning citizens, engaging them in water reclamation careers with the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District. So Einstein once said that in order to understand a problem, or to solve a problem rather, we have to understand it. And that means that, if we had an hour to solve a problem, Einstein would spend 55 of those minutes studying the problem and 5 minutes solving that problem. Unfortunately, what tends to happen typically in this day and age is that we take a little bit of information and we run in attempts to solve it, which oftentimes leaves those solutions a bit lacking. So I want to take a moment today to simply go back to the very foundation of the concerns that we're seeing in terms of environmental injustice. There is not a single societal issue that we cannot link back to race and racism. So I want to qualify that statement by providing some perhaps new or perhaps maybe even old information for you. But to start, I want to define exactly what race is. And to do that, I'm going to borrow the definition from Dr. Milana Karinga. And Dr. Karinga illustrates race as a specious classification of human beings created by Europeans during a period of worldwide colonial expansion, using themselves as a model for humanity, for the purpose of assigning and maintaining white skin access to power and privilege, and to legitimize the dominance of white people over non-white people. Now, I recognize that this is a very weighted statement, so let's unpack it a little bit more. English is not my first language, so when I first saw the term, specious classification, I immediately thought that somehow meant species. But actually, specious classification actually means plausible, but superficially plausible, but actually wrong. And so when we dissect this, we can see that Europeans created the concept of race during a period of worldwide colonial expansion for the purpose of assigning and maintaining access of white skin to power and privilege. So when we talk about race, even though this is something that is socially constructed, we know it's not real. We know that there's no biological evidence of race being a reality. Because of the structure of race and the utilization of it, we have created the concept and the system of racism. And racism as a system is simply an established way of getting things done, right? And so it is essentially the advantage and disadvantage based on the idea of race. However, we don't actually have a commonly shared understanding of what racism is, which I think is also part of our problem in helping to understand what environmental justice is, why we see the racial inequities that be so pervasive to this point in 2021. So based on that definition of race and racism, we can then understand that racism involves the systemic disadvantage of people of color. It's built into our US systems and our institutions. It's deeply woven into our political and social structures here in America. And the system of racism continues to function and thrive because both members of the oppressed and the privileged groups are socialized to play their roles as normal and correct. So, as I mentioned earlier, a good number of the US population is still using terms like racial prejudice and racism interchangeably. These are actually two very different things. While anyone is capable of being racially prejudiced, racism requires the combination of racial prejudice along with social and institutional power. And when I say social and institutional power, I'm referring to access to resources, the ability to influence others, access to key decision makers to get what you want done, and the ability to define reality for oneself and for others. So, to give us a little bit of a micro history lesson on race in America, I want to bring us all the way back to a period of indentured servitude. Now, prior to the introduction of utilizing the enslavement of people for free labor, we had indentured servants. And so anyone who was coming to this newly colonized land, typically from Europe, was able to acquire around 50 acres or so of land for every ticket that they purchased to voyage to the new land. Now, if someone was not wealthy enough to make that purchase themselves, they could engage in indentured servitude, and their quote unquote master would pay their way. And so that master would get their own 50 acres along with their indentured servants' 50 acres of land that was stolen from Indigenous people and given to white colonizers. So because of this setup, this was during a period when multiple people of varying identities were engaged in indentured servitude, not just whites. And there was a lot of tension that was brewing amongst poor whites who were not yet called whites at that time. That didn't get instituted until the House of Burgesses in the late 1600s. But that was intended to essentially create a separation between what was otherwise categorized as ethnics and other people of color who were indentured servants and the poor whites, so to speak. So as the House of Burgesses created the concept of the white man and assigned various privileges to that, some of those privileges included that their masters were required to provide those designated as white with 50 acres of land, 30 shillings, a musket, 10 bushels of corn upon completion of their servitude. This then created some incentive, if you will, for those who had come to be known at that period of time as white, with incentive to complete their servitude. For anyone who was not categorized as white, so Polish, Irish, Italian, anyone from the southeastern European countries was not considered white at this time. In fact, not considered white until the late 1920s, when they petitioned to be classified as white to obtain those privileges. So I'm sharing this with all of you to help illustrate the very source of the racial inequity that we are seeing today. So one of the key determining factors of thriving and wealth in the United States is acquisition of land. And if we follow where land has been acquired and how it has been distributed, we can also follow the inequities that has produced over time. So in 1790, again, we have the naturalization law that specified who was categorized as eligible for naturalized citizenship. This was only given to those who were classified as white and male. We also saw the scientific justification, that is in quotes, from Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, a German craniologist, to address some of the heightening abolitionist movement from everyday folks, white folks who were against the practice of slavery. So even though Johann Friedrich Blumenbach found there to be no scientific evidence of any difference in genetics between the quote unquote races, he still decided that the Caucasian race should be classified as the highest level and the most perfect version of humanity, hence going back to our original definition of race, and placing the Negroid race at the bottom of that hierarchical structure, contributing to the perspective of global anti-Blackness. So you can see here from his quote where he states that still it be found serviceable to the memory to have constituted into certain classes, which are the men of our planet may be divided. So with that as foundation, I want to talk a little bit about some legislation that has also helped contribute to inequities that we see today. The Social Security Act, as an example, was created to provide public assistance to millions of workers and to serve as a safety net. But the impact that that legislation had on whites was not the same for non-whites. In fact, for non-whites, it explicitly excluded domestic wage workers, farm workers, maids, who at the time consisted of about 75% of the Black population who were working in those categories. The Wagner Act, which made labor union monopolies legal and helped whites gain middle-class entry over the next 30 years, essentially allowed dominant unions like the American Federation of Labor to successfully lobby against the prohibition of racial discrimination in their labor unions, also contributing to the existing culture we see in the unions today. Specifically with the trades. The Federal Housing Act, also touted as a very positive legislation, helped generate much of the wealth that white families enjoy today, allowing them to send their children to college, to leverage the equity in their homes, to pay off debt, to buy more property, to take care of their parents. These pieces of legislation contributed to the overt denial of mortgages based on race and ethnicity and helped to establish redlining as a means of justifying the denial of financial services to certain neighborhoods based on the racial and ethnic demographics of the residents. If you are not familiar with redlining, it is this practice of proclaiming that certain neighborhoods were high risk for mortgage failure. And today, 91% of those areas that were classified as best in class in the 1930s, so those blue and green line areas, which are typically the suburbs of most of our counties around the nation, remain to this day 85% predominantly white and upper to middle income. In addition to redlining, there are various racial covenants connected to properties that were established in those blue-lined and green-lined locations. This one example is from local historian Reggie Jackson, but you can also find this at the Golda Meir Library if you're so inclined, would like to look up examples of racially restrictive covenants. And this one states that none of the buildings erected upon this subdivision shall be used to house either for business purposes or residence purposes any colored persons or others outside the Caucasian race. And the conveyance of any lot or lots in violation of the restriction shall ipso facto constitute forfeiture. So in plain English, this means that only white people are allowed to live and reside in this space. If you choose to allow a non-white person to live in this space or to sell to them, you forfeit your ownership of that property. Some of these racially restrictive covenants were set to expire in as long as 2024. This became unconstitutional with the Fair Housing Act of 1968, following the murder of Martin Luther King. So I share this with you, friends, to help illustrate how, despite the fact that all groups of people paid into the tax levy that went to support the builds in the suburbs and to offset the cost of home ownership for whites, 98% of the federal funds, that was around $190 billion, went exclusively to white families only. Now, when we take the historical inaccess to building wealth through home ownership and land. And mind you, we're not even getting into what happened to communities of color that, despite all of these existing barriers, were still able to amass some amount of wealth and success. That's a conversation for another workshop. But we're still seeing to this day the disproportionate outcomes, even in when we talk about race and drugs and incarceration. Despite the fact that whites report using substantially higher amounts of illicit drugs, we don't see that same representation in our federal prison system or in our local jails. We also have seen that the racial wealth gap has nearly tripled since the 1980s. And even when we account for education, race more so than education is a key determining factor of pay. When you can see here, we compare white high school graduates to Black and Latino and Latinx college graduates. When we look at maternal outcomes, again, race more so than education or wealth is a key determining factor of what babies survive past their first birthday, as well as which mothers deliver their babies early. At this point, 60% of Black women are more likely to deliver their babies early than white women, and Black infants are 230 times more likely to die before their first birthday than white babies. I share all of this with you to illustrate that when we combine these quote unquote target race neutral policies, historically exclusionary wealth accumulation practices and policies, state-sanctioned genocide, slavery, and violence against people of color, these all produce the racial inequities we see today. And because of wealth inequalities and inequalities in distribution and acquisition of land, we also see that correlate to which communities get exposed to the most toxins. So America is a very young country. And in fact, oh, I'm sorry, that slide is missing some numbers, but essentially we are about 52 years out from legalized segregation, right? That's not even a full lifetime of a human being. So while we are a very young country, we've accomplished a lot, but we still have a very long way to go in terms of achieving true liberation for people. I also want to talk about how, despite the fact that people of color and folks of lower incomes tend to have the most firsthand experience with environmental injustice, we don't see those same individuals represented in key environmental decision-making circles. So when we refer to environmental racism, we're talking about any government or industry action or failure to act that has a negative environmental impact that disproportionately harms, intentional or not, individuals, groups, or communities based on color. So if we take a look at the existing exposure around polluted air currently, 71% of Blacks are breathing polluted air. 50% of Latinx people are breathing polluted air, and 34% of whites are breathing polluted air. But let's take this a step further. When we compare overall pollution exposure to pollution production, Blacks are exposed to 56% more pollution than they cause. Latinx are exposed to 63% more pollution than they cause. And non-Hispanic whites are exposed to 17% less pollution than they cause. There are also three varying types of inequalities when we are discussing environmental issues. There's geographic, procedural, and occupational and/or social. So the first, geographic, is the discrimination in the placement of environmental hazards in predominantly non-white and poor locations. This tends to be, if we were to superimpose where some of those environmental hazards are placed, oftentimes they are placed in what was formerly known as redlined areas, as well as various reservations and other poor counties. Locally unwanted land use, LULUs as they're called, so landfills, incinerators, lead smelters, refineries, these are not neutrally scattered around our nation. They're actually concentrated in high minority populations, low income neighborhoods with lower property values. when we discuss Superfund sites, these are sites where toxic wastes have been dumped and the EPA has identified them for cleanup. When we look at how these Superfund sites are treated, they take 20% longer to get listed with the EPA in communities of color. They're also 500 times higher penalties for hazardous waste violations in white communities versus communities of color. And the federal penalties are 46% higher for environmental law violations in white communities. Some examples of this would be the medical waste incinerator of Chester, Pennsylvania, the pig farm overflows of North Carolina, Cancer Alley in Louisiana that continues to see new incinerators erected every year. So when we take all this into account, I want to just help illustrate a bit more on how our social identities can either compound our experiences of privilege or our experiences of oppression. Now, by no means is this an exhaustive list of identities, but there are a set of identities that most of us are fairly familiar with. So when we discuss race, we know based on data that the dominant race in the United States and globally is what would be considered white or Caucasian. For gender, we have male, sexual orientation, ability, class, education, age, national origin, and religion. We know many of these things because of how we are conditioned to perceive norms and who is otherwise categorized and treated as an other or marginalized. The powerhouse essentially serves to sustain bias and oppression. And unless we are actively working to dismantle the powerhouse, everything we do is in support of it. But it's really difficult to disrupt the powerhouse and, quite frankly, to disrupt any system unless we are actually willing to name the problem. You see, friends, when we have this multitude of racial disparities, and yet our address or our response to that is essentially Band-Aids, such as meal programs because of food insecurity, or after-school reading programs because of low achievement scores in schools. All of these Band-Aids serve that mere purpose. And unless we are actually addressing the root cause, which is systemic racism, we're going to continue to, quite frankly, put Band-Aids on bullet wounds. So some additional examples of geographic inequities can be found in Chicago's Toxic Donut, East Madison's Truax field, where PFAs continue to be infiltrating groundwater due to our military and local firefighter practices, the Hunts Point in Bronx, Hunters Point in San Francisco, Kettleman City, West Dallas, as I mentioned, Cancer Alley, and other issues with Native American reservations. The second form of inequality is procedural. This is the unfair and discriminatory procedures for making and enforcing environmental rules and regulations. As we saw with our New Deal legislation, just because something is law does not automatically make it just, and certainly doesn't mean that it impacts people neutrally. So some examples of this are that, as I mentioned, white and Anglo communities see faster action, better results, and stiffer penalties against polluters than non-white communities. Public hearings and documents are often only presented in English. And just to reiterate, the higher penalties for hazardous waste in white communities versus non-white communities. And again, the fact that it takes significantly longer for Superfund sites to be listed when they're located in communities of color versus predominantly white communities. Occupational and social inequality is another form of environmental injustice, where the disparities in power and wealth are also accompanied by social exclusion, poverty, and low wages. This can be connected to a lack of affordable housing and significant exposure to hazards and overall community social decay. we know that some examples of these occupational and social inequalities show up in employment, where, for example, non-unionized farm workers and heavy industry workers are exposed to higher rates of hazards, or sorry, environmental hazards. Homes, for example, tend to have more lead contamination in their paint and in their pipes. Which also brings another point up around utilities and wealth also. So contrary to popular belief, most folks with lower income who are availing themselves of payday loans are not actually using that funds to offset their lifestyle or purchase tennis shoes, as is often promoted. Based on research, actually, most lower income individuals who are availing themselves of payday loans are doing so to cover costs for utilities, because many of their homes are not weatherized. And so their heating and cooling bills tend to be significantly higher than with buildings that are newer and have been kept up much more. Schools, of course, in working class environments tend to be, or neighborhoods rather, tend to be located closer to Lulus, incinerators, and brownfields. And lower income communities tend to be exposed to more polluted air based on being the closeness to freeways. When it comes to food, also, fish consumption is more likely to have exposure to mercury dumping. We also have food deserts and just general malnutrition as well. So in an attempt to solve some of these inequities, environmental justice advocates are working towards the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, creed, color, national origin, or income. And works to ensure that those impacted by policy have a say, meaningful involvement in the policy creation. And so when we say fair treatment, we are referring to the desire and the requirement that no group of people should bear a disproportionate share, rather, of negative environmental consequences or impact from either industrial, governmental, and commercial operations or policies. So some principles of environmental justice that we uphold are that we guarantee the right, rather, to environmental protection for all people, that we prevent harm before it begins, that we shift the burden of proof to polluters rather than the burden of proof being on those impacted, and to redress existing inequalities. Which also requires that we eliminate the intent standard. The intent standard requires that plaintiffs prove that they have been intentionally harmed by the corporation or owner of the incinerator or the government in order to reach a settlement. We are advocating for a disparate impact standard instead, to replace the intent standard. So the Wisconsin is, with our new leadership, our new-ish leadership, we are definitely moving in the right direction as far as addressing some of these environmental issues. But as of 2020, the racial inequity seems to be pretty significant here in Wisconsin as we compare to other Midwest areas. So, for example, besides Massachusetts, Wisconsin was the only state to receive a grade of F in reference to the level of people, number of people of color and low-income residents living within 1 mile of a dangerous chemical facility in comparison to white and high-income residents. Also, children of color in the state of Wisconsin are twice as likely to live near hazardous chemical facilities than white children. And many of the state's high-risk facilities are located in Madison, Milwaukee, and the Fox River Valley. So we know that when we develop teams and organizations that consist of diverse perspectives and experiences, these teams are more innovative, more adaptive, better at problem solving, because they have a deeper and a broader pool of experiences and perspectives to work from. They have more unique skills. We still see that despite the fact that 15% of, organizations that are gender diverse tend to financially outperform organizations that are non-gender and ethnically diverse, we're still seeing that our main organizations are failing to have senior leadership that actually reflects our US ethnic labor force. In fact, the environmental labor force for both government, I'm sorry, I don't know why this is going so fast, both government and philanthropic, and non-for-profit, the total number of representatives of people of color are under 16%, which when you look at our general population, people of color represent about over 30% of the population. Even the tech industry currently has representation of over 30% of their workforce being people of color. So the environmental industry doesn't quite have an excuse, in my opinion. This also is interesting when we talk about how we discuss these issues, right? Even here, when we're referring to the changing demographics of our society, that we are moving towards a white minority, if you will. That could bring up a lot of feelings of tension for folks who have been benefiting from these historical inequities. And so while yes, by 2045, we will have the majority of our population will be people of color or identified at least as mixed race, there are a lot of folks who are not super happy about that. And consequently, there are also people who believe that majority somehow will automatically equal shift in power. To that, my friends, I have to say, we don't have to look much further than South Africa to know that majority does not automatically equal power. To this day, 80% of the wealth and land in South Africa is owned by whites, who consequently make up less than 9% of the population in 2021. So as we begin to implement this knowledge into our whatever places of power we occupy, I want to warn you that as you implement policies and practices that promote fairness and equity, those who have been benefiting from social exclusion, from marginalization, will feel threatened. And we have seen that over the past few years show up in our social conversations. So I want to address a few myths, which are keeping a lot of the environmental industry stuck. One is the assumption that Black and Brown people are simply too busy being poor to care about the environment. The truth, however, is that people of color care more about conservation issues than whites. And the Nature Conservancy conducted a study to prove this a few years back, where they saw that people of color care more about the pollution of our rivers, lakes, and streams than whites. They care more about climate change than whites. They care more about toxins and pesticides in their food than whites. They care more about the pollution of the oceans than whites. They also care more about loss of habitat and fish and wildlife and loss of natural areas. Now, the other myth that is often touted is that people of color aren't interested in careers or they are not qualified, which also begs the question of the laziness that we are engaging in around actually conducting questions around these topics. So there's a very big difference between what environmental leaders are saying they value versus what they're actually doing. In fact, as of the past 2 years, with numerous corporations and companies and nonprofits touting very flowery diversity statements, when we conduct studies with the staff of those organizations, asking them, have you seen any actual change internally? That answer is quite bleak. So if anyone is curious about some of this data, an organization called Green 2.0, which is headed by principal researcher Dorchetta Taylor, who's based out of Minnesota, I definitely recommend you check out their site and their various reports, specifically Leaking Talent, that came out either this year or late last year, which highlights how the representation of people of color in environmental people from their homelands that they had cared for centuries. So we can continue to pretend like this is not an issue, and that because something is not a problem to us, it therefore should not be a problem to anyone else. And we can continue to just think that, well, the reason why our organizations are so predominantly white is because that's the only people who are qualified or interested. Or we can actually take a critical lens to this and say, we need to stop relying on good intent. Being nice is not going to eradicate systemic racism from our practices. We have to commit to being disruptive and to know that when we are uncomfortable, that simply means we are experiencing something new for the first time. It doesn't mean that something wrong is always happening. We also have to begin recruiting outside of the club, right? Which means that we have to stop expecting that everyone is going to have this group think or be a culture fit, if you will, and rather think about what perspectives, identities, and experiences do we currently have and are we lacking, and how can we make sure that we create an environment where where everyone feels that they can thrive and that their differences are a value add. Because genius is equally distributed, but access is not. We want to be able to create and communicate clear pathways into our organizations, into civic engagement, into policy creation, and ensuring that, again, those hit first and worst by environmental injustice are at the forefront of key decision-making tables. I'm showing you this particular graph here to just to drive home even further the myth that people of color are not interested in the environmental sector. What we are seeing here actually is that the longer that people of color are within these historically white institutions, the less likely they are to stay for numerous reasons, as you can see here. And we know that this problem can be solved because when we look at gender in terms of leadership in these environmental organizations, more than 70% of directors of environmental organizations are women. More than 1,700 of the leadership positions that were studied by Green 2.0 also were filled by women. The issue, though, is that they were all white women, right? So we do know that we've seen a significant shift in representation because people have made a concerted effort to mentor, to create space, to decide that a woman was going to succeed them. We can do the same with racial and ethnic equity. So here's the thing, though. We cannot expect that peppering in people of color into our organizations, into our clubs, into our institutions is going to be enough to save us, right? We have to actually do the work. We have to create an environment where we are allowing our team and our staff to be uncomfortable and not cater to the fragility of people's emotions, but intentionally start to comb through your practices, your policies, or lack thereof, so that when you do open the door and bring someone in, you're not expecting them to co-sign existing practices that are contributing to the social inequities that we continue to see today. So it's not enough to simply think that racism is bad. We have to be actively anti-racist. And I invite you to join me and many others who are audacious enough to believe that better is actually possible. And what I mean by that is we actually have to take a critical lens to understanding racism to begin with, right? This is not a good or bad binary option. We don't have the option to say you are either racist or you are not, right? And even having that perspective gets us really caught up in being obsessive about how people think we are rather than actually doing the work. This work cannot be about how people perceive us. And Dr. Beverly Tatum illustrates this so eloquently in her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? She starts off by explaining that racism is like an airport walkway. And to borrow her words, she says, I sometimes visualize the ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway at the airport. And the act of racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the conveyor belt. The person engaged in active racist behavior has identified with the ideology of white supremacy and is moving along with it. Dr. Beverly describes passive racism as a behavior that is equivalent to standing still on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves the bystanders along just the same in the destination as those who were actively walking towards active racism. Active anti-racism, however, requires that the bystanders feel the motion of the conveyor belt, see the active racist ahead of them, and choose to turn around, unwilling to go in the same destination as the white supremacist. But here's the thing, my friends. Unless we are actively walking in the opposite direction, at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, we too will be swept up, much like the active racist, into the same direction and carried along with them. So while this conversation is about the systems that intertwine and overlap to produce the racial inequities we see today, I would be remiss if I didn't highlight the realities that people create systems and people sustain them. So if you truly want to change and address and eradicate systemic racism, you have to start with yourself. Now, if you're curious about where you can start with yourself, these are some books I would recommend. Thank you. We have a couple minutes, so I don't know if anyone has any questions. I'm happy to take any with the last few minutes that we have. I'll put the slides back up with the readings too, just in case. Absolutely, Jody. And if anyone would be interested in further information, I'm going to put my website and email address in the chat. Actually, I might have to have Worf do that, but. So I see one question here. What do you see as the current challenges within the philanthropic areas? So anyone working in philanthropy should drop everything they're doing right now and read the book Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva. The reality here, friends, is that philanthropy itself plays a huge role in sustaining racial inequities, just by the very nature of how that wealth has been acquired and the control that philanthropic organizations have around who gets funding and what people are funded to do. So I think to answer the question simply, the biggest challenges for philanthropy is that they need to get out of their own way. We designed our company specifically to be a for-profit model, which uses our profits to do it for a social good, to combat the unfortunate realities and shortcomings of philanthropy, which is quite frankly just a manifestation of the shortcomings of capitalism, which we are all participating in under duress, as my colleague, Dr. Monique Liston says. Any other questions? And again, that book is Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva. Also a great read if you are a recipient of philanthropic funding. All right, everyone. If there's no other questions, I'll give you back 5 minutes of your life today. Thank you so much for being with me here today. I really enjoyed it. I know that was a very quick overview.